Today I'm going to do a little presentation, and the key word is little, on Vida Goldstein, and the Australian way, Vida Goldstein. Okay? Now, she's one of the most important radical activists since 1788. And she is someone who basically, apart from her suffragette work, has been forgotten. Now, Vida was born in Portland.
I know.
I'm sure you do, because you sat on the seat there. That's right. Yeah, I'll tell you why there's a seat there one day. At the end. She was born in 1869 in Portland. Had an illustrious career in the middle stages of her life. And I'm going to break up her life into 3 stages: early stage, middle stage, late stage, because it's huge differences. She died in 1949 in South Yarra as a virtual unknown. And this was a woman who in the early 20th century was a byword in Australian politics. So who was she? She was the daughter of Jacob Goldstein and Isabella Hawkins. Jacob was a dashing young artillery officer who was born in Cork, in Ireland, of Irish, Polish and Jewish background. Isabella Hawkins was the eldest daughter of one of the largest squatters in the Portland region, a Scottish gentleman, I think called Proudfoot Hawkins, Samuel Proudfoot Hawkins. Now, they met in 1867 when Jacob was appointed as an artillery officer in the Victorian garrison. Because remember, at that particular stage, every state had its own military apparatus, because they were independent colonies. We weren't a federation. This country wasn't a federation. They were both social reformers. Isabella was a suffragette, her mother, and a teetotaler. And you've got to remember that the anti-alcohol movement at that particular point in time was a strong movement because of the damage that alcohol was doing to family structures at that particular point in life. Not that things have changed much, but it was an epidemic then. So she was a suffragette, teetotaler. Her husband was also a social reformer. They were both social reformers. They were both devout Christians, and they were involved in many activities promoting social reform. Like Jacob was a member of the, believe it or not, the Leongatha Labour Colony, which was established in the 1880s and closed down in 1925, which was established to give unemployed men accommodation and work in the Leongatha region. And there is a student currently doing a PhD on that colony. He's also a member of the Women's Hospital Board and a number of other organisations. Isabella was a strident suffragette, and she was heavily involved in obtaining signatures for the Monster Petition, which was presented to the Victorian Parliament, I think it was in 1892, signatures collected in 1891. Now, where does Vida come into this? She was the eldest of 5 children. 4 daughters, 1 son. There was Vida. Now, let's get this right, Joe. There was Aileen. There was Esma. There was Lena. And there was the young lad, Selwyn, right? So it was a family of 5. Now, as Jacob went up the military hierarchy, he became a colonel eventually in the Victorian artillery garrison. He moved down to Brisbane. The family moved down to Brisbane when Vida was 7 years old. Right? Now, Jacob was a As a social reformer, he was also interested in ensuring that his daughters were educated. He paid for private tutors, and Vida was sent to the Presbyterian Ladies' College in 1884 and matriculated in 1886. Now remember, this is marvellous Melbourne. There's gold rush money, speculation, especially in real estate, a little bit like today. Prices were spiralling. There were many private banks, and what happened in 1890? Marvellous Melbourne became seedy Melbourne. Over a third of the banks collapsed. The government wasn't able to pay its employees. Wages went down. So the Goldstein family had financial difficulties. So what Vida did at the age of 22, her and her sister Aileen set up a private preparatory school, co-educational school, a fee school, which is unusual, co-educational. They set it up in 1892 at their home in Alma Road, Caulfield. So through that school, they were actually able to ensure the family didn't go bankrupt. So until her late 20s, nobody knew about this woman. She was this statuesque principal of a private school that prepared students for school, for the real school, the private education, her and her sister. And they ran the school from 1892 to 1898 for 6 years. Then they closed down the school. This is the downfall of young Vida, and we move from a period where basically she obtained an education, ran a private school, and was egged on by her radical mother, Isabella, to become more involved in the suffragette movement at that particular point in time, the women's movement. Now, while she was at the school, she was a member of two societies. The National Anti-Sweating League, which is not what you think it is. It's basically about, poorly paid, exploited labour, and also the Criminology Society. She really wasn't involved in any activities outside keeping the family financially head above water. In 1899, she befriended a woman that some of you may know. Well, historically, not personally. Although you're elderly, you're not that elderly. She befriended Annette Bear Crawford. Now, Annette Bear Crawford was a leading suffragette in Victoria. She was secretary of the United Union for Women Suffrage. Right? And when Annette Bear Crawford suddenly died, Vida stepped into her shoes and became the secretary of the United Council for Women Suffrage in 1902. And in that same year, she had gone to the United States to an international suffragette convention. So what happened between 1899, and this is something you won't see in the history books because people don't put this together. What happened between 1899 and 1902 when this virtual unknown, who was a secretary of an almost moribund, organisation, suddenly, whose picture and articles about her appeared in all the newspapers of the period, and she became a household name. Simply, and this is an exceptional story, anybody heard of Maggie Heffernan? In January 1900, Maggie, who was described as a good Christian girl, had a baby out of wedlock because of the activities, this is very important, of a philandering scoundrel, right? This is the story, right? And when she was discharged from the hospital, she wandered the streets of Melbourne, confused, hungry, and in January, mid-January 1900, drowned her baby near the Princess Bridge. Now, usually this was a common occurrence that women would practice infanticide because there was no support for single mothers of any type. But in this case, Maggie's baby was discovered in the Yarra, right down where Docklands are. And she was arrested, tried, found guilty of murder, and was sentenced to be executed, right? It was a particularly brief trial. The defence weren't that interested. And so Isabella and Vida took a personal interest in this woman's case. They went down to the prison, especially Vida, interviewed her on a number of occasions, and organised petitions and rallies to have her released from prison because they were talking about, postnatal depression. They used to call it postpartum depression in those days. They were talking about the fact there was no social support. Now, the difference between Maggie Heffernan and most other women who found themselves in that situation was that her family was a respected family in the Goulburn Valley region, respected Christians who went to church on a daily basis, who knew nothing about their daughter's pregnancy, and who supported her daughter. So she was, I know it sounds horrible, but she was kind of the case you need to generate public sympathy for that situation this particular person found themselves in. And it was Vida, through her efforts, which brought the case to the public's attention. Now, the Executive Council was established to look at death sentences, and they decided, because of the circumstances, that the death sentence was commuted and she was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Now, Vida still continued to agitate and organise petitions, and the interesting thing was she got more signatures to save to Maggie Heffernan than they got to get Save Ed Kelly, 30 years earlier. But the interesting thing was that eventually, after 16 months, she was released from prison. Right? So this case is what brought Vida Goldstein to the public's attention as a radical activist. And she raised issues like a separate children's court. There was no separate children's court. Equal property rights in marriage. Birth control. Votes for women. A living wage for workers. Not just, the suffragette struggle for a vote. So what happened is, here she is, she's in the public domain. People know her as a campaigner. They know her as a successful campaigner. So what happened? The country federated on the 1st of January 1901. Now, interestingly, in 1896, the South Australian Parliament accidentally, and the key word is accidentally, passed legislation to give women and Aborigines the right to vote in the lower house in the South Australian Parliament. When Federation occurred in 1901, it was based on the principle that any right that an individual enjoyed in a particular state could not be put aside through federation. So in the first election in 1901, women, as well as Aborigines in South Australia who were enrolled, and that's the key, being enrolled, were allowed to vote in that first election. In 1902, Parliament passed a vote to give women the vote federally, because you couldn't just have people in one state enjoying a right that people in other states didn't enjoy in the federation. So here we are, we've got Vida Goldstein, now Secretary of the United Council for Women's Suffrage, a household name in Melbourne. So what does she do at the 1903 election? She stands as a candidate for the Senate on the back of all that publicity that had been generated as her and her mother and other people fought for the release of Maggie Heffernan from jail. And just in case you're wondering what happened to Maggie Heffernan, she married, had 2 children. Her husband was killed in an accident at Bega Butter Factory at Koolyarrup in 1915, and she lived to the ripe old age of 88 and died in 66 or 68. So that's Maggie's story. So she had a good life after that. And obviously there are descendants of Maggie Heffernan around the place. So getting back to Vida. So by now she'd become almost a full-time political organiser. Not because she had inherited money behind her, like many of the suffragettes did in England, but because she was a brilliant speaker. And she could, and you'd be charged to go to a speaking, engagement, and that's one way they raise money. But more importantly, she set up a number of women's newspapers. She established the Women's Political League, so the Women's Political Association in 1903. She established the Women's Fair, which was a monthly magazine which she was an editor of, and she took the advantage of becoming one of the first women to stand for federal parliament in Australia. There had been women who had stood for election in the lower house in South Australia because they had that right since 1896. So there were 4 women around Australia who stood for federal parliament in 1903 on the back of the Political Amendment Act, which gave women the vote. There was Vida Goldstein in Victoria, there was Celine Anderson, and these are people have forgotten. Celine Anderson, Muriel Martell, and Mary Moore Bentley. Now, I haven't followed the other 3 women because they're not part of this talk, but I did look at her 1903 results, which you can see, if you go to the relevant websites. And in 1903, there was a 52% turnout for the federal election. She received 51,000 votes, which was 16.7% of the formal votes, but didn't poll enough votes to acquire a Senate seat, but came very close to it. Now, so what happened? Did she rest on her laurels, or did she continue that struggle for social reform? Once again, she used the publicity that she was able to generate locally to become an important speaker for women's suffrage around the world, not just Australia. And she was so well known that in 1911, she was invited to do a tour of England by the Women's Political and Social Union. And it was an outstanding success. And many people said it was just the shot in the arm, sorry for the analogy, that the women's movement in England had for women's suffrage. Because let's not forget that women didn't receive the vote in England, I think, until 1918. And they didn't receive the vote in Victoria until 1908, although they could vote federally since 1902. Her lecture tour was so successful, she was invited to the Holy of Holies of suffragette heaven, which was Eagle House. Now, Eagle House was near Bath, and it was set up by, I've forgotten who it was, but, somebody, who had a bit of finances, as a resting house for suffragettes who'd been imprisoned, and many suffragettes were imprisoned in England as a resting place after they were left prison. And she was invited to stay there and, more importantly, plant a holly tree in the garden. So if you ever go to Bath, look up Eagle House and maybe there'll be a plaque where Vida Goldstein put this thing. So at the minute, everything revolves around electoral politics. In 1910, she stood again for federal parliament 7 years later and obtained about 12.5% of the vote in Victoria for the Senate. And she stood again for parliament in 1913, 1914 and in 1917. Now, something happened dramatically between 1903, when she received 16.7% of the vote, and 1917, when she received 1.1% of the vote, which is about the type amount I usually receive, which means you lose your deposit. So what happened in that intervening period? What made this Mother Teresa of the suffragette movement a pariah in her own country, and how did it affect her long term?
All her boyfriends did.
No, she never got involved.
Never.
Well, sure she did, but I don't know.
No, I was only having a joke. All their boyfriends went off to fight the war.
No. Well, you kind of stumbled on it, young lad. And here we go. See, when you go to Anzac Day ceremonies, you think that this country was a united country during World War I. It was not. What happened is the Labor Party split, 1/3 crossed the floor and joined the opposition under Billy Hughes, because the Labor Party was in charge at the beginning of the war, and he joined the Conservatives on the question of conscription, right? And it wasn't a referendum, but Billy Hughes had promised the English Empire an unlimited supply of money and men to fight at the front for the glory of God, King and country. But there was huge dissension in the community, although 420,000 men volunteered to fight for the British Empire from a population of 5 million, and these are volunteers. The government of the day, led by Billy Hughes, which was a Conservative government, wanted more men, because you've got to remember that in one night, 800 Australians died in the Battle of the Somme. One night. 8,000 and 62,000 Australians from the 420,000 volunteers died during World War I, and another 60,000 died of their wounds within 10 years of returning home. And think of all the damage caused to families of people who'd seen the horrors of horrors and came back with massive post-traumatic stress disorders, which were called,
Shell shock.
Shell shock. I knew you were bright people. I knew it. That's why I'm here. All right. So, what does our young Vida Goldstein, who now is in her mid-40s, what does she do? She teams up with Adela Pankhurst, who's living in Australia, Jenny George, another radical activist, and Cecilia John, I think a soprano and radical activist, and they form the Women's Peace Army. And the Women's Peace Army's main aim was to defeat the first anti-conscription referendum in December 1916. And although there were many laws passed very similar to this country's anti-terror laws during World War I, they defied the authorities, went across the nation, held public meetings, and Cecilia John would usually start off the public meeting with the song as a soprano, "I Didn't Raise My Son to Be a Soldier," which was banned by the state at that particular point in time. Now, interesting, I was at a children's concert in December last year at the Dandenong Town Hall. And there's an interesting, the old Dandenong Town Hall, the old one. And there's an interesting thing on the wall, a plaque on the wall, which was only put up a few years ago, and it shows 2 meetings, one for conscription and one against conscription. And the public meeting against conscription, people were spilling out into the streets, right? Although the authorities were doing their best. You know, people were getting white feathers, they've been told they were cowards, inflation increased, prices increased. There were food riots in Melbourne in 1917. So what? She became secretary of the Women's Peace Army. Now, the Women's Peace Army wasn't an electoral-based organisation. It was an organisation based on direct action. And in December 1916, the Women's Peace Army, which was based at Story Hall in RMIT, which they rented out, not just as an office, but just as a food and clothing distribution centre for people who were suffering as a result of war profiteering, which was a real issue, which led to the food riots here in Melbourne in 1917, with over 10,000 women. So they set up this organisation to organise protests around the country, the Women's Peace Army, which she was secretary of. Now, by this time, Vida Goldstein's opinions had changed. They'd actually got harder. She was a pacifist and an internationalist, and believed the only way to address the situation was through international cooperation, anti-war cooperation, and pacifism. Now, the combination of the Women's Peace Army, the Roman Catholic Church, which was mainly Irish under Archbishop Mannix, and sections, about 2/3 of the trade union, was that the plebiscite wasn't a referendum. Because if it was a referendum, they couldn't have introduced conscription for World War II and the Vietnam War, right? It was a plebiscite, the first one. It was a plebiscite. They lost the ability to conscript people to fight in the war. Now, the Women's Peace Army, which she was the secretary of, was instrumental in the agitation. Now, in 1916, there were about 700,000 people living in Melbourne. She, as secretary of the Women's Peace Army, and Adele Pankhurst and Jenny George and Cecilia John, organised a march just before the plebiscite on the 21st of December 1916, which drew a crowd of over 100,000 people on the Yarra Bank, which is over 15% of the population, men, women and children, of Melbourne. And only women speakers were allowed on the stage. Okay? So, as Vida gets older, she's becoming more radical, and she's been isolated by more moderate elements within the suffrage movement, within the temperance movement, within the social reform movement, within the women's movement, because her reforms were basically reforms which were directed against a private investment for private profit mentality, capitalist mentality. So although they were successful at defeating the second plebiscite in 1917, when she stood as a candidate in the Senate in 1917 at the next federal election, she only obtained 1.1% of the vote because of a more radical position on internationalism and pacifism.
So as the female vote had got turned away?
Yeah, people got turned away.
The female vote.
Well, it could have been both.
Yeah,
both. People weren't willing, although of all the work she had done.
But you mentioned 3 groups.
Yes.
That she was at loggerheads with.
Well, she wasn't at loggerheads with. They were not happy with the change, and obviously from 50,000.
But under their banner, under their 3 banners, would have been a lot of women.
Yeah, but we don't know who voted. It's a secret ballot. We don't know. I assume that people as a whole were turned against her because of the more radical position she was taking, you know, her pacifist internationalist position. Because you've got to remember, in those days, we all thought, well, we weren't alive, but the British Empire was the prominent aspect of people's existence. You had the White Australia policy introduced in 1901. It was mainly an Anglo-Saxon-based culture. People, you know, even if they were against conscription, they were for the British Empire. And as an internationalist, she was about creating a society beyond sovereign borders, with cooperation. So, what happens in 19... Well, she's a little bit disheartened. So what do you do if you're a radical activist, you're disheartened, and you've got an international reputation?
Can I ask you a question?
No, I'd like questions at the end, all right? Because I want to do the presentation and questions at the end. Otherwise, we lose the flow, you know, for the video. Sorry about that, Vic. But I will answer any questions at the end. So, what do? You're an international known activist, known as a pacifist, an internationalist. You know, you've made money on overseas tours. She went back to Europe at an international pacifist convention in 1919 and spent 3 years in Europe. Didn't come back to the country. When she came back, she was seen as kind of a respected radical actor, and she made many contributions to publications at that particular point in time. Publications she wasn't an editor of. Some of them were mainstream publications on topics like pacifism, internationalism, social reform, women's rights, birth control. In many regards, if you remove the revolutionary element, she was a reformer. She was kind of an Emma Goldman, Australian Emma Goldman, all right? So, and then, all of a sudden, by the mid-1920s, she disappears from public sight. So remember, she was born in 1969. By the mid... 1869. She was 31 at the turn of the century. By the mid-2020s, she was 31 plus 25. What's that? She's nearing her 60th birthday, right? So, people's lives go in phases. The next phase of her life was she embraced, guess what? Guess what? Spirituality. No, she didn't become a gambler. Spirituality. And she became a leading light in the Christian Science movement. Right? No, it didn't exist then. Christian Science, well, you know, it's a particularly radical form of Christianity. There is still one Christian Science library, I think, left in
De Graves Street.
Yeah, De Graves Street, yeah. It's kind of almost St Kilda Road, yeah, it's almost
And a school.
And a school.
And a school.
She became a healer, Christian Science healer, a Christian Science member, and a Christian Science preacher. For the last 20 years of her life, she devoted she'd done the hard yards, she'd made a splash, she'd changed attitudes, but then she was rejected by the Australian people because of her more radical philosophy. So she was looking for solace. She never married. She never had any children. She was, and she ended up living with two of her sisters in the later part of her life at their home in South Yarra. So we all need solace in our old age. Some of us gamble, some of us drink, you know. Some go to lectures. And some take up a quasi-religious type of life.
Oh, it worked for her.
Yeah, it worked for her. It didn't harm anybody.
Are you taking membership for this
What?
Christian Science?
No. I'm a card-carrying atheist. You know, I'd love to be a believer, but unfortunately, been a doctor for 50 years.
God has rejected us.
Well, God rejected you, speak yourself. I'm still waiting. So,
good luck to you.
So she dies, 1949, unannounced, not mourned apart from her family and close friends, and is cremated, and her ashes are scattered to the winds. Now, she was rediscovered with the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, and two things happened. She had an avenue named after her in Chisholm, in Canberra, and in 1984, I'm not sure it was Hawke or Keating, they named the electorate of Goldstein after her. Right? Now, the reason I'm looking at this today is there's an interesting battle going on in Goldstein. Goldstein is, or was, a blue ribbon Liberal seat which was won by a teal called Zoe Daniel. And she won against that wishy-washy Liberal character, Tim Wilson.
So
Now
what suburbs are these?
These are Bentley, Black Rock, Sandringham, Beaumaris, Brighton.
So that's Goldstein.
Goldstein. Murrumbina. That's Goldstein.
No, Murrumbina.
So there is this battle now going on for the soul, in my opinion, of Vida Goldstein. Do they vote for a teal candidate who won the seat off a blue ribbon seat, and it looks like she's going to lose, or do they vote for Mr. Wilson, a flippy floppy Liberal apologist? So I did make a mistake, and this is where I will, admit that. And I never admit making mistakes, obviously, but I did make the mistake of saying in the introduction leaflet, not talking, that she would be rolling in her grave. She'd be turning in her grave at the prospect of Tim Wilson winning the electorate. But unfortunately, as you suggested, she was cremated, right? And that's why when you go to Portland, you sit on some seats which will remember her name.
That's why some apparitions you just see sort of smoke.
Yeah, well, all I can say is it was a remarkable life. She's a remarkable woman, and she should not just be remembered as she is today for being involved in the movement to win women the right to vote. She was a social reformer. She fought for equal property rights in marriage. The case of Maggie Heffernan led to change in legislation in 1904, which meant that women who were jilted by their partners, right, could actually sue for maintenance. This is a right which had never existed in Australian society, so they could sue for maintenance, right? This was a change in the legislation because of the Maggie Heffernan case and because of the work of Vida Goldstein and her mother, Isabella, and other radical women activists at the time. Her activities led to the creation of the Women's Hospital, Jessie McPherson Hospital. Now, when you go to the CBD and you go to your little rallies at the State Library, look across to the right, not at RMIT, and you'll see this huge metropolis of shopping centre. In the middle of that metropolis is a little 3-storey or 4-storey, what I call facade left of the Jessie McPherson Hospital, which was built through women in this state donating a penny to the creation of a hospital just for women. And when the Cain Labor government came into power, they closed down Jessie McPherson, they privatised the hospital, and after a little bit of struggle, they left a little wing to the women's movement, to Wire and a few other women's organisations.
Yeah.
So think about that, because that should still have been a public women's hospital, and even if it was closed down, that site should not have been privatised, and it was privatised.
My mum nursed that.
Yeah. And another interesting fact which you may find interesting. Remember the protest against the chocolate, was it Israeli chocolate company? Max
Brenner.
Max Brenner. Now, everybody who was arrested was acquitted. Why were they acquitted? Because they were not protesting on private land. The section in front of what's left of the hospital is public land, and it is still public land. It's like when we used to protest outside the Herald Sun building. We could never be arrested because a lot of the trails there are still public land, on the Lands Titles Office. They're public land. They were never privatised. So there's all these... But what I'm saying is, it was women like Vida, many who you don't know of, who were involved in that great change. Children's court, no separate children's court. Things like a living wage, non-sweated labour, and the list goes on and on. So she was involved in many of these activities, not just the struggle for the right to vote, over 3 decades. So I think she is entitled to have a peaceful life as a Christian scientist healer in the last 20 years of her life. So I will beat up anybody who denigrates her for that, because she did the hard yards. She was rejected. Let's use a Christian analogy. She was crucified by her own people, and that's it. Any questions?
We should get a statue to her
Exactly.
put up. You know,
I did a stamp with that.
Yeah, I did a stamp.
sorry.
Stamp.
That one would probably work pretty quick, Joe.
A statue. Even the statue of Velda. Even the statue of Velda de Prano, where most of us knew personally, was actually built on and paid for by Trades Hall. Wasn't built on public land.
I contributed.
Yeah.
It was a lot of women contributed.
And
to
it wasn't
getting
built
that
on
done.
public land. It's been built on Trades Hall land. Because it's very hard. I'll tell you why. And this is what happened. When we were involved in the Tanami Minaway and Morbohina struggle, we were actually able to dance around the discredited former mayor, Mr. Doyle. Because there was no mechanism, right, via which the council, the Melbourne City Council, was able to deny a public movement if we gained enough support in the Melbourne City Council to create the Tanami and Morbohina monument and for them to pay for it, right? After we won that battle, before Doyle was exposed for what he was, what happened is they set up a memorial committee, and any proposal for a memorial to anybody or anything in the city of Melbourne has to be approved by the memorial committee, which is when I was trying to get another statue involved for Mr. Norman. You can't get through that. It's a very conservative committee, and they usually put the Kybal on things. But I can't see what's left of the women's movement, because I think WIRE? W-I-R-E? WIRE?
Yeah, Women's Information Referral
I
Exchange.
think they've actually in 2008 set up some type of bursary for her. I can't see why the women's movement, and to some degree the trade union movement, can't actually get together to push for some type. It doesn't have to be a statue, but some type of memorial to Vida Goldstein.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, see, she's been resurrected, but only has somebody campaigned for the vote for women.
Yeah.
Not as a social reformer, which is what she was. That's how she began her journey. If it wasn't for Maggie Heffernan and that child that was killed, she would have been no one.
But with the way things are these days, it'll be pretty easy to generate all this support in the code.
It's much, much harder to generate today than before.
Why?
Because you can't really put any direct pressure on your elected political representatives. This recent council election has resulted, I think there were 7 members elected. There's only 1 pro-Labor and 1 Green, and 5 die-in-the-wall neoliberals on council.
In the city of Melbourne.
In the city of Melbourne.
It's an undemocratic voting system that was set up by Canada that gives businesses and landlords more value of vote than residents. And so the residents who live in the council of Melbourne, say in areas like North Melbourne and Kensington, they're not represented. And you have these business people from Toorak
Yeah,
who
well,
have shops and that. They get 2 votes.
Yeah, but let's not forget that the Labor Party in the state has been out of power for 4 years since Kennedy. And any time they can change that legislation. They've never changed that legislation. And they've made it harder for people for a reformist or radical agenda to be re-elected because they now have ward electorates, which makes it much harder for a candidate for a radical position to be elected as a councillor.
Melbourne doesn't have wards.
No,
Yeah.
but they've decreased the number from 9 to 7. So, you know. All right, you're going to ask some questions, Vic. Have you forgotten that?
That last one I wanted to ask you, that 1917 one.
Yeah.
What was the next war or insurrection or whatever you want to call it? Where the only thing I can think of is the Black and Tans.
In 1922, yeah.
Going to that was 1922, was it? So it's too late.
The war hadn't finished. The war didn't finish till end of 1918, November.
1918.
They did.
What I was trying to put together was the soldiers going off to war. With the way you were describing this thing, I would have expected that a lot of them would have been voting for her. That's the way I was picking up on it.
Look, all I know is she
And
was.
the women that were losing all their guys probably come to the realisation that it'd be a good thing to vote for.
That's right. That's right. And that's what the anti-conscription struggle was based on. It wasn't based on internationalism or pacifism. It was based on self-interest, basically. Do you want your son? And if you look at the propaganda in the posters of the period, do you want your husband, your son, your uncle, to be killed on the front? Because by that time, the death toll was increasing rapidly among the volunteers. And interestingly, what's that?
Why did it backfire on her?
Because she was different. She just wasn't anti-war. She was anti the sovereign nation state. She was internationalist. She felt that the only way to break down war was to break down national barriers. That's why people turned against it. And also, holding that position meant that she was against the British Empire. And at that period in time, that was the be-all or an end-all. Although you may have voted against conscription to save your son or your husband or your uncle, you most likely still believed in royalty and the British Empire.
Yeah, but what about all the convicts? Wouldn't have been too happy.
There were no convicts then.
You also got to remember the ruling class were on the offensive because there was already upheavals in Russia. They were paranoid about Bolsheviks, 1905 upheavals, and then of course there was the Russian Revolution that came. So there was a real anti-internationalist, anti-communist backlash. So anyone who challenged the British Empire was tarnished with the same brush as Lenin and Trotsky.
Yeah, she was seen as basically a traitor to the country. So if you put all your energy and effort into struggling for so many years and then you find yourself in that position, you do what I do and bash your head against the brick wall again because I'm an idiot.
You're just trying to put some brains into the bricks.
Yeah, I think so. Or you do what Vida does and actually take an international tour and enjoy yourself and come back and join a religious group. So if anybody's got any suggestion about what religious group I should join, what's that?
Create your own show.
Faith healing? I think I could do that. I reckon I convince people. Faith healing.
Hare Krishna's a story.
Oh, I don't like dancing and music. Give me a break. I've always thought that
you don't
Cromwell.
have to
I always thought that Cromwell was right, and I've got a lot of sympathy for the Taliban, not for their policies, but the fact that they hate music.
Pass them round.
There is a limit,
sweet.
What have we got?
I'd like to go to one of these.
Alright,
I can't also do these Christian fundamentalist hallelujah, knees up by the ground ones. Maybe a good Dower Scottish Methodist church would be my type of thing.
You
Friends.
can't drink biscuits.
You can't drink.
You can't drink.
Where?
I don't think they can drink the Methodists.
No, Methodists tend not to. Yeah.
Yeah, like you know the movie Dirty Dancing. That was based on it.
Yeah, well, the Methodist religion they broke away from the Anglican Church because alcohol was devastating the working class movement. And if you look at the Labor Party in England and in Australia, the emergence of the Labor Party, many of them were devout, dour Methodists.
Labour Party.
And it came from that anti-alcohol movement.
Yeah, well, some of the trade union movement were anti-alcohol. There's a real schism in the trade union movement.
Understandably, yeah, as we all drink.
No, I'm not worried. Don't worry.
Yeah. Any more questions? I think we should put a limit on people asking questions, but we won't do that too big.
Isn't Wilson from
That business about where you said she was allowed to vote by accident. What was this accident?
She was what? Elevated?
No. She got the vote.
No, I didn't say she got the vote by accident. What I said...
What's that accident? What was
what I said is, when Maggie Heffernan murdered her infant baby in the Yarra near Princess Bridge in January 1900, right, it struck a chord in the Victorian people about how unfair it was that women were placed in that position. Now, the woman, Maggie Heffernan, was sentenced to be executed, right? Now, it was people like Vida Goldstein and her mother Isabella and other feminists of the period who took up the case, explaining the social circumstances behind it, and the thing, even then there was such a concept as postpartum depression or the blues, postpartum blues, and they took up those issues, and it resonated with the Victorian public because this was a good Christian girl who was, basically found herself in that position because of a philandering, male, right? So that meant that there were these constant petitions and articles in newspapers, protests, which raised her profile as she was the secretary of the United Council for Women Suffrage. Right? That came a little bit later, but it raised her profile and allowed her to become well known in the public sphere. So when she stood for the Senate in 1903, when you were voting for her, it wasn't as if you were voting for some relative unknown like myself or you were voting for somebody who had some created respect for them and their activities in the Victorian community. And that's why she got that big vote in 1903. And when you look at the history, there are books written about it, but very few link the fate of Maggie Heffernan and the fact that she took on that cause which would have been totally unpopular. You think about it. It would have been totally unpopular initially. They think, oh, this is just another, loose living woman who's drowned her kid, who gives a shit. But she took that on and actually was able, by interviewing her, talking to her, bringing the position to the public attention, harassing government members, going to the Executive Council, through her doggedness, she was actually able to not only lead to the freedom of Maggie Heffernan, but the change of the law so that males who absconded from their relationships and their responsibilities could be, and obviously not everybody could do it, but could be pursued through the courts, Victorian courts, for maintenance. So she was a public figure.
I think she had the courage to say what everyone knew.
Yeah, it was in their heads.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. And most people would prefer to ignore the idea that some girls get pregnant because of, bastards that leave them. And they just like to, every family you would know would have some daughter or niece or sister or someone somewhere that had happened to. And even if they put on an act in public of being just disapproving or bored by the whole thing, when they were by themselves, the idea would turn up, and she was the one who had the courage to put her finger on that spot
That's right.
and keep it up.
And keep it up, and that's the key.
Yeah.
If you look, there is a section in the on the web where it's got quotes from her, you know, quotable quotes, and what she says is the political success comes. I'm leaving. That's the dog. She said that political success comes from doing this, you know, revision over and over and over and over again, pushing the same idea over and over and over again. It's not about, and this is something I've been saying for decades, I'm sure you all say, it's not about the big, massive demonstration where you get pictures in the paper and disappears 24 hours later. It's about those people who continue, like the Palestinians and like us on the steps of Parliament, who continue week after week after week to bring the matter to the public's attention. And you're quite right, that's what she did. She had the courage to do that. Any more questions?
Yeah, that's what it takes.
Yeah, that's what it takes.
Not so much a question as a comment, but I really do. I appreciate all the effort you've gone to give us all this information. That we are keeping her alive and her work while we remember it. You know, I guess. I mean, she could just be written off and forgotten if we don't do that.
Yeah. Parts of her lives were remembered with the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, but other parts of her life which weren't, you know, politically palatable at that particular point in time.
And they should have been.
You know, who was the politician that stuffed up the hospital? Who was it?
Kane.
Oh,
John
Kane.
Kane.
Well, how come his love and kisses didn't beat him over the head with a floating rolling pin?
Who did that? I don't know that.
His missus.
No, I'm just saying, why didn't she to stand up for
Because it
women?
didn't affect her.
I don't know.
Probably
They're
has.
both
Private
dead.
health insurance.
As far as I know, they're both dead. So have a chat to the spirits.
They
Go to
do
Christian Science.
Can I tell you about John Kane?
Go on.
I was protesting outside a Labour Party conference. I think, still in the Labour Party, but I'm not sure. I can't. But anyway, and John Kane was there. I mean, in front of me, and I'm going, what do I say? What do I say? And I was totally lost for words. So I said, John Kane, and he looks me straight in the eye and went, John Kane, you're a creep.
That's a big political statement, isn't it?
A few months later, he's gone.
Well,
Yeah.
Not because of all the crimes.
No.
Not because of, what was the bank in Geelong?
Pyramid.
Pyramid Society collapsed. Not
No.
because the state was in total chaos, but because you called him a creep.
That's
I like
right.
that.
I said, John Kane, you're a creep, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
So be careful what I say.
We have a modern day witch amongst us. What's this? Watch out, Paul. You've been cursed.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
You just cursed him, didn't you?
I didn't curse him.
See?
Take care.
Right, well, you did wrong.
If I call you a creep, be careful.
All right. Call me a creep. Come on. Oh, you're leaving. Okay, good. Nice to see you.
Can I have a look at that?
Pete, I'll be in
Oh,
touch.
so I've given it back to the bench.
Okay.
Oh, let me go.
Now, just before you go, I'm afraid I'm going to have to change the March one to the third Wednesday in March,
Okay.
because the first Wednesday in March I'm going to go away for 2 weeks at the end of the month just to freshen myself up for the election campaign. But so it'll be and I'm going to look at Australia's blood debt during the Depression.
Australia's blood debt.
During the Depression, why blood wasn't enough.
So it's the third Wednesday.
Yeah, and I'll advertise the third Wednesday, 6:30 for a 7 p.m. start. Third Wednesday.
What's the word about Australia's blood debt?
Yeah.
Do we run out of blood?
No, no. If you were alive in the 1930s, it was a big issue as far as depression is concerned.
The blood debt.
The blood debt wasn't enough.
I never heard of it. What does it mean?
Where's Gaz?
No.
Where is
In,
Gaz? It's not-
Gary,
There was a lot of dissension in Australia.
Remember the inventions.
One of the main
Association
reasons
meeting.
there was so much
It's all right,
unemployment
though.
and the collapse of the
Yeah.
financial system wasn't the stock market collapse in New York. It was the fact that the London banks wanted their money back, which had been lent to the Australian government till during World War One. And the Australian people were saying, we paid a blood debt, 62,000 dead. That should cancel the debt.
Absolutely.
And the Labor government, which was in power then, said, no. And plunged the country into it. They could have just ignored the London debt.
Yeah.
They fuck off.
I mean, they could ignore AUKUS too.
They could, indeed.
They still could.
They still could. They should be made to. It's a disgraceful idea.
Well, we won't have a blood debt. We'll just be evaporated. In nuclear warfare, there's no blood, is there? You just disappear. Yeah.
It does. I know this is nothing to do with. Well, it could. It is. It could be. But is anyone concerned about the rise of like right-wing neo-Nazi type stuff?
Yeah, starts promoting it.
Everybody is.